always, for centuries, have understood parenthood to be a noble and thing to do, a noble role, a role of generosity, a role of sacrifice. And now it's really, I think the implication is really that it is something selfish.
Welcome to Matters of Soul Importance, where we dive deeply into topics of both earthly and eternal consequence. I'm Roxanne Solonen, faith columnist and features writer for the Forum, author, and speaker. My guest today, Noelle Mering, caught my attention this past summer when she was interviewed by Lila Rose, founder of the pro-life organization Live Action, on her podcast, tackling the topic of young adults becoming estranged from their parents, a phenomenon that seems to be growing in recent years. What Noelle and a small swell of others are doing to help women today understand the value of their vocation as mothers and wives is really unprecedented and life-changing to those who come into contact with their vision. It is one shaped by the church, Jesus himself, and comes with the promise of a more abundant, grace-filled life for those who are predisposed to receive it. However, with this work also has come the challenge of combating a culture with very different ideas about what leads to human flourishing. And in this regard, I consider Noelle and her collaborators true Joans of Arc today. They are not pushovers, but are doing what they can, where they can, to shape the culture by touching those in their midst with truth, even when it's not popular. Noelle's interview with Lila exposed some very crucial points that many families are dealing with today. I ended up using some of her takeaways in a talk I gave this summer, and it was clear that those in attendance were moved, for they had experienced the heartache of children walking away from God and walking away from them. And for a parent who loves their children, there may be no greater heartache. Unfortunately, it's much too common right now. I have walked with mothers who have been through this fire, and it is gut-wrenching to see parents who have sacrificed much for their children being so casually discarded. Today's topic is serious and can be a source of controversy as people discuss whether estrangement is primarily the parent's fault or the child's. Noelle will give her thoughts on the matter, developed through working on her latest project, a book addressing the modern no-contact movement, and how it differs from estrangement in the past. What is driving this, and what are some less obvious consequences of it, along with, helpfully, ways to repair these broken relationships? If you haven't experienced estrangement personally, you likely know someone who has been touched by this in some way, so hang on for the ride here because it's going to be informative and hopefully helpful in bringing healing in the lives of families, perhaps a family that you know well. Welcome, Noelle. How are you doing today?
I'm doing very well. Thanks for having me.
You're all the way in California. How are things there today? Is it beautiful and sunny?
It's beautiful, sunny, but chilly. We just got over a lot of rain, which we needed, but now it's nice to have blue skies again.
Yeah, well, we've got them here too in North Dakota. So today we're going to attempt to answer the question, why are so many young adults going no contact toward their parents? I don't know if I should say on their parents, toward their parents, but either way, this estrangement that seems to be happening. But before we start, I want to get to know you a little bit better and let the listeners hear about you. So how did you find yourself diving into these serious cultural topics like estrangement? But before we even get there, go back even further. I want to hear about your faith life, kind of a little bit about your family, where you grew up, because it just helps set the tone for this, and it's matters of soul importance. So we're going to dive into that kind of stuff. So if you want to share a little bit about your history and then lead into how you got into the work that you're doing now.
Sure. I'm a lifelong Californian, except for 2 years, one in Ohio, one in Massachusetts. But I was raised in Central California, sort of an agricultural area, raised Catholic, and then wound up going to an evangelical college. And I had sort of left my faith in high school, just a public school kid, and just a natural drift away from faith life. And in college, I got to know so many wonderful Protestants and sort of just started questioning kind of why I was raised Catholic and just natural college kid stuff about questioning the way they were raised. I think my dad sort of glommed on the fact that that was happening. So he started bringing me to apologists kind of conferences, apologetics conferences with really kind of these giants of the faith and both apologetics and theology. And so it just was really helpful. I started to really kind of grapple with all these questions. Meanwhile, I was dating my boyfriend, who is now my husband of 27 years. He grew up evangelical Episcopalian, actually, kind of a funny combination. But and anyway, so long story short, he wound up converting, I wound up reverting, and we've lived very happily for 27 and a half years now. We have 6 children who are not really children anymore. They range from 13 to 26, and our eldest 26-year-old daughter had our first grandchild with her husband about a year ago. So we are parents of 6 and grandparents to 1. So yeah, that's been our sort of personal and faith journey.
Can I ask you? Yeah. Because I have young adults too, and but what was sort of the thing that made you leave do you remember why you left the faith kind of initially, and even though you came back?
Honestly, I think it was just a real natural pull towards kind of my lifestyle, always partying and going to mass seemed like obligatory. And the thing that actually really brought me back was at one of those conferences my dad brought me to. It was Father Fessio and all these, Ron MacArthur. Anyway, we went to mass and I realized I knew enough to know that I couldn't receive communion because I was living in a state of mortal sin. I hadn't been practicing the faith at all, hadn't been to confession. And so I hadn't been to mass in a while, and I realized, oh my gosh, because of my choices, I have separated myself from what I truly believe was the Lord. And when I think back on that moment of grace, because it really was the catalyst for bringing me back to the faith, I realized I had to have 2 beliefs in order for that moment of grace to be received by me. And one was I had to believe in the reality of sin and to see it and to know it, not sort of be in denial about it. But secondly, I had to believe in the true presence of the Eucharist and that it was not something I could casually receive in that state. So I think those 2 beliefs combined, I really have a lot of power to pull us back and keep us on the right track, because it just begs the question or poses the question, if you are separated yourself from our Lord in the Eucharist, why, what, and wouldn't you want to do everything you can do to get back in communion with him? Because you know how, what a miraculous and communion that is, and that he's given us himself in the Eucharist. So it was really sort of that knowledge that then kind of turned into a fire, and then that fire turned into action, and it's been sustaining me ever since. So thank you, God.
Yeah, I'm going to ask you one more question, because our audience isn't going to all be Catholic, and the idea of mortal sin, that just sounds like, oh my gosh,
Yes.
Can you kind of just explain that briefly, so people who might have been caught on that word might?
Sure. Well, there's different ways to look at it. I mean, I think Protestants have a correct understanding in one way, in that, all sin is really something that pulls us from him. And so it is in one respect the same. However, the Catholic understanding of sin is that it really affects our soul differently. If I, without thinking, say a white lie and I didn't mean to, or if I do something, but there was kind of external pressure on me to do it, and I made a decision out of passion and it wasn't really deliberate. We even in our court system, we understand that there's degrees and differences in the gravity of murder, for example, if it's a moment of passion versus if it's calculated. It doesn't necessarily, but in the other respect, the effect is the same, right? You've killed someone and it's awful. So it's not saying like one is okay and one is bad, but it is saying that there are distinctions that we can understand. And so we have the same thing in the Catholic Church, where a mortal sin is a sin that is grave. So it's serious, grave matter, and it is done with free will, done with full consent of the will. So that's why passion can be a mitigating factor, because we don't really have our full rational faculties if we make an action out of, in the moment of passion. But to deliberate and say, I understand that this is a grave sin and I am going to engage in it anyway. That is a sort of rebuke of ourselves against God that is uniquely able to kill kind of the life of grace in our soul. So it really means that our soul has lost the presence of grace, and it can be restored. But in order to restore it, we have to go and ask our Lord. So we have to, first of all, understand that what we've done, speak what we've done, and then be contrite about what we've done and ask for our Lord's forgiveness. And so for me, that process is both supernaturally healing, but also very naturally healing. I think there's something really powerful and important about having to own up to what we've done and to see it clearly, and to try to look at our souls with reality, because we are so prone to deluding ourselves, and then speak it to another human being. I mean, obviously it can be anonymous. I have a confessor, so I tell him, this is Noelle, every time I go to confession, which is actually makes it harder, way harder, because, I want this priest who I respect to really like me and not to hear about what an idiot I am. But that part of that humility, that's good for my humility. It's part of the process. So, but it's not mandated that you have to do it with your name. So, but you do have to do it, and the priest is standing in persona Christi. So it's God forgiving us, but through the material of the priest.
Well, one of the things I just mentioned to a faith group that I'm into, and I've said it before, but God already knows what we've done.
Yes.
So it's not about, we shouldn't be scared to go to God. I think it's just that human person that we're like afraid to do that, because I think everyone is reluctant or it's human to like not want to talk about what we've done wrong. It's just, it like strikes us in the heart. But
that's right.
Like you were explaining, it cuts us off from God. It's not like the church is saying, you naughty little, girl or whatever, but instead it's like, you've dulled your senses. You've dulled your ability to see God's will when you are in mortal sin. And so that's why the church wants you to get right with God before you can receive him. So anyway, that's all beautiful. And thank you for going there. So, did you have siblings?
Just one older sister who we're very close. She lives about an hour and a half away, and she has 6 kids too. So it's really fun.
Okay. I have one older sister too, and just the two of us. And I just have to say, I admire your dad for taking the bull by the horns and, grasping on while he could. And what a beautiful thing. Is he still alive?
No, he passed away 3 years ago.
Okay.
Yeah, but he was great. We had a wonderful relationship.
That's awesome. Okay. So moving on. So you're in college. Our stories are very similar. I did I didn't really leave altogether, but kind of, I consider myself a revert, because in my heart, I was kind of not sure and kind of leaving or not. Anyway, same thing, got a lot of questions in college and I wasn't sure. And then I married a non-Catholic and ultimately came back 3 years into our marriage. And then he followed, he became Catholic the same night that our first child was baptized. So it was pretty special.
Oh, how beautiful.
Yeah. So I just have one less, but I do have a baby that we miscarried. So I have 6 kids too. So we're really similar.
Are similar. Oh my goodness.
Yeah. So, okay. So how I met you, really, like I kind of knew about you, but I heard the video that you did with Lila Rose this summer, and it was like, wow, it just filled in so many blanks. But how did you get into this? I mean, I know you take on different topics, but estrangement is one you're really working on right now. You have a book, I think, that's almost ready to roll out. Is it out there yet?
No, actually, it's coming out September 8th, so it still has a ways to go.
Okay.
Yeah. But as the manuscript is done, we're just in sort of final copy edits.
Yeah, and you're knee deep into this topic, so I'm looking forward to hearing how you got into it. How was it that I'm sure it wasn't something you graduated from college and said, I want to go speak about estrangement and write a book about it.
That's right. No, I spent most of my adult years married and having babies and raising them. So I was a stay-at-home mom. I was always sort of had my hobby horse of kind of paying attention to cultural events. And, I think I had two sort of loves that kind of drew me into it. One is that I really love people. Friendships have always been really important to me, and navigating them well has always been important to me. But I've also really loved kind of debate, and I'm really interested in cultural issues. So one thing that just has fascinated me for, I don't know, maybe 15 or 20 years is just, we have all these Christians, Catholics, Protestants believe in Jesus Christ, believe in, ostensibly natural law, kind of more, that there's a moral law, all these things. And compassion and, all the things that we Christians believe. But then they get translated so differently into the public square and in such heated ways. And so that was always interesting to me, why there was such disparity, not only amongst the pluralistic society, but within the Christian church as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I have that in my family, as most people do. And you know them to be good people who disagree with me to be very good people, admirable, loving, thoughtful. And so it's just always been fascinating. How do we both understand this difference, and how do we navigate it well in our relationship? And so I started writing about first the woke movement in 2018. The prompting of my co-author from Theology of Home, Carrie Gress. Actually, I was talking about something with her, and she's like, "You should write an article about this." So I published it in National Catholic Register, and then just realized, oh, that's something I didn't know I could do. And so I just started publishing and submitting things more and more on the woke movement. And in those 2 years before I started writing Wake Not Woke. Meanwhile, around 2019, we wrote our first Theology of Home book. So Theology of Home is a book series. There's 4 in the series. The first 3 co-authored by Carrie and myself, and the 4th by Emily Malloy, lovely woman. So we wrote Theology of Home 1, and then that sort of established, I guess, me as a book author. And then in February of 2020, I pitched the idea of Wake Not Woke to my editor at TAN Books. And he said, let's do it. And so I sat down and started writing in the beginning of March. And then 2 weeks later, the quarantines began, and my kids all came home to be homeschooled. And then that summer, of course, was 2020 summer of writing and all sorts of chaos and division. So it was really bizarre to be writing Awake Not Woke and seeing it explode everywhere. I mean, it's a movement I was alarmed by for years before, but it really came to a head, I think, in 2020. And then that came out in 2021. And so because of that, I started going around the country speaking about the woke movement, at the same time writing Theology of Home 2 and 3. But I would say it was the 5 years or so, or 4 years of speaking about the woke movement. One of the most common Q&A questions I would get, I mean, I would really see the evolution of the questions. And 2 things started to rise to the fore. I started getting more and more questions from people who were encountering transgenderism in their families and not sure how to deal with it, how to respond to it. But secondly, at every Q&A, I started getting a question from a parent who would say, my kids barely speak to me. We started our political, disagreements we used to be able to navigate them, but now we cannot. And maybe they've been totally cut off, or their relationships are really strained. And so I got a book agent, and I approached her with the idea of writing something to sort of be kind of preventative before that crisis evolves. So kind of like a boostering the family. It's going to be called Family Revival. And I had an editor at Penguin Random House who eventually became an editor, Matt Burdett. He's wonderful. And my agent Keeley is wonderful. Anyway, but Matt said, they want something that's more kind of crisis oriented, or not that that's what, I'm not exactly sure if that was their correct framing, but they wanted something a bit different. And so he said, why did you want to write this book? And I said, because I keep seeing all these parents who are being cut off from the kids. And he's like, well, just write the book about that. And I'm so glad. I thought it was really wise. And at that time, I had not even heard the phrase no contact, I don't think. This is probably a year or so ago. It's been a long process. And then as I was writing it, I mean, that phrase exploded everywhere. No contact, no contact, and now it's, really moved from the margins into the mainstream. So it feels a lot like writing Awake Not Woke. When I was writing Awake Not Woke, it was exploding. And as we're writing No Contact, the No Contact movement was exploding. So
right. You're just on the tip of things. You're just right there. God just put you right there. Before we go much further, I want to make sure we define woke because some people might be triggered by that word or whatever. And so how would you define woke? Mm-hmm.
Well, there are various ways to define it. Some that are more kind of universally agreeable, and others that are, I think, more explanatory. So I'll try to find something maybe in the middle. Woke is an ideology, and like all ideologies, it operates based on things that are real and true pain, true suffering, true trauma. But it sort of explodes the solution in a way that is a totalizing force, where there's only one way in which we can address that suffering, one response that is acceptable. And it really is based on sort of a view of the human person that is quite philosophically different than I would say the Christian or Catholic one is. That all relationships should be viewed through a lens of power, and that we are progressing as a society to sort of a more perfect end. So when people say you want to be on the right end of history with a capital H, that is a real philosophy that's rooted in a philosopher named Hegel. It is ultimately in its application now an atheistic philosophy. It's seeking to find a perfection in this world, utopian, earthly society. And it has all sorts of ramifications that make us full of conflict. And that conflict, according to the ideology, is an engine towards change and towards getting to that perfect society. So conflict theory means that you have to expose the opposition and you have to amplify sort of the antagonism in relationships until you explode them. And then insofar as you amplify, stoke them, and sort of let them come to a head, you're advancing society. So that antagonism is going to be stoked amongst identitarian categories: man versus woman, woman versus man, race versus another race, cis person against transgender person, now parent against child, child against parent. So collectivizing people into categories where they are reduced to an avatar for a politicized identity is part of the woke ideology, and I think is part of what makes us both in sort of chaotic conflict and also in a bit of despair, because we feel that the way to change our life is to change society, not to change ourselves. And so I gave you a lot, but I think all of those are factors that go into the woke movement. I understand why it's appealing. And I think that one of its kind of powers and why it's compelling is because it really operates on very universal human temptations. I want to think that my problems are not something that I can change within myself, but that are something I can point to and blame about society. That kind of absolves me from any guilt or responsibility, and also gives me a pleasure of outrage. And I think that's one of the things that, we've realized is that outrage can feel pleasurable, and we all can become addicted to it, regardless of whether you're woke or not. Conservatives can become addicted to outrage just as much. Even that is part of the conflict theories, for everyone to constantly be reacting in outrage to the other and never stepping out of that cycle and trying to actually repair and resolve things personally.
So I'm going to ask kind of a out there question, but as I'm listening to you describe this, what is the end game with this philosophy? Like what, a utopian for who?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's a great question. And it has to, the one distinction has to be, I think that the ideology has its deeper end game, but I think the people who are often proponents of it or promulgating it aren't advocating for the ultimate end game. They think that they are just kind of trying to create a more compassionate society. But I think the mechanics of the woke movement, the end of the ideology is really chaos. It's breaking things down without a positive vision of what can be. So utopia really is not a kind of a positive vision. It's sort of a get rid of this, get rid of that, explode this, dethrone that, just deconstruct this. So it's always a negation. And I think that's why we've seen in every society that is sort of similarly adopted sort of this utopian ideology that it ends up with a lot of dead bodies, because it ultimately, the person who is standing on the wrong side of history either has to be re-educated, converted, or concluded. They either have to be utterly coerced into adopting the ideology, or they ultimately have to just be ended, either through death or through imprisonment or what have you. So that sounds really dramatic to apply to what we're seeing now, but I do think that this is I do think that this is a different application of the same ideology, and it does tend towards violence. And I think, that's, people are starting to see that a little bit more now, that there's a lot of a sort of an instinct towards violence.
Yeah. When I was reading about Karl Marx and the devil and Karl Marx, around the same time you were probably writing that book, I was, one of the things that sprung to mind, and I wrote a little bit about it, but he was in his bathrobe at his home, writing this philosophy, and he had other players involved too. But and he kind of just died a strange death with some of his family committing suicide and such. But meantime, his writing and philosophy and vision. Billions have died, as he sat in his bathrobe, and that was the effect. And I guess my next kind of question is, how does this contrast, this idea and this philosophy, with the Christian worldview?
Well, I think maybe one basic contrast would be that the philosophy of someone like Karl Marx or the woke movement is one of social reengineering, that the human person does not have any fixed nature. They can just be reengineered and remade into something according to sort of the experts. And the Christian philosophy would say, no, we are designed. We have a telos. There's a purpose that's imbued in every human person, and you can see it in the way that they are created. But there's also a purpose, for their life, for their soul, for their relationships. And so there's a great meaning imbued in, and there's an intelligibility to the universe that implies a moral character to it. And so you can't just remake people. You can't just remake and change our nature fundamentally, that we are what we are, and that gives us sort of what we ought to be in that design. So I would say that that's probably the biggest difference, is that is there meaning or is there not? And you can see this in, for everything from the sexual revolution to the transgender movement, that there's a fundamental meaninglessness to things, that I can, it's liberation means I have to decide what sex means. I can decide what marriage means. I can decide even what my body means in opposition to my bodily reality. I can decide what my sex is or gender is. But and that sounds like power, but all it means is that if you can be anything, that just means you mean nothing. You're sort of putty. And so I think it promises a lot of power, but ultimately it offers only despair. And I think the Christian worldview, in contrast, everything is imbued with meaning. And that means even your suffering is imbued with meaning. And so your suffering can be sort of redeemed and redemptive and powerful in that way. Whereas I think the suffering of the materialist worldview is very, there's no place for it. There's no meaning for it. And so it only is a vehicle for outrage. And so there's no way to suffer well, suffer beautifully. You want to suffer loudly and, suffer to make change in society. But the Christian worldview has, because everything's imbued with meaning, that's one of my favorite aspects of it. Even our suffering means something. And I think that is hopeful and rich and leads to a lot more harmony than the other movement can.
Can you explain, while we're on the topic of suffering, because I think some people would say that it's more of a Buddhist idea, that we don't need to suffer. And I think, or certainly like to embrace suffering, it just sounds so contrary to what some people think. Can you just really briefly kind of go into like why, what you just said, like explain why that can be a beautiful thing?
Yeah. Well, I guess because our Lord redeemed suffering. He came here and modeled love that means suffering to the ultimate price, right? To torture, to humiliation, to suffering, and to ultimately to a violent death, and then for the sake of love. And so I think that showed us not only the great price that love is willing to pay, an ultimate price that love is willing to pay, but also that we can unite ourselves more closely with Him insofar as we see our own suffering through that lens, that we say, this is not something that I can't, my will is not the ultimate authority. That's because every suffering is something going against our will, right? If I stub my toe, or if I get chronically ill, or if someone humiliates me or something, my normal will is not wanting those things. But the greatest saints, the people who are closest to our Lord, they say, okay, this is not my will, but your will be done. And so this is an opportunity for me to subjugate my will to the will of God, the providence of God, to trust Him, and to find an opportunity in this to love more beautifully and more like our Lord would. So, suffering is all of a sudden becomes this opportunity, this fantastic opportunity to grow in love of Him and of our neighbor, and to really kind of tamp down that beast of our ego, that beast of our desire to kind of have everything be under our control, under our power, to kind of mitigate that and to kind of give over ourselves to our Lord. And then in the beautiful paradox of the faith, we become more fully free. We become more fully human. We become more fully ourselves in that offering.
One more theological question that came up that I'm always thinking about: how are people going to react to this or that? I'm reading something right now. It's by a monk, a priest, a brother from North Dakota. I had gone to his abbey with my mom and sister 2 summers ago, and he met him in the bookshop, and he told us that he had just been diagnosed not long ago with stomach cancer, and he was going to die. And he started writing about it. And so he put together a little spiral bound book just
just for people. And I'm reading about it now, and he's talking about the permissive will and the positive will. And I think that's important too when we're talking to the world right now, as far as explaining God doesn't. He's not a mean God making bad things happen and making us suffer, right? I mean, there's so I don't know if you want to tackle those real quick.
No, that's really important. I think that's exactly right. There's this, God has an active will and what you say, permissible. He allows for evil to happen, and he doesn't. He's not going to intervene in every, but he is present in that too, even in his permissive will. That is part of his will, but it's not his active will. It's actively willing our good. And his permissive will allows things to happen because human beings are free, because there's original sin, that there is going to be suffering and there's going to be, and he permits that because he doesn't want us to be robots who, never have to encounter any struggle. It is good. Oh, happy fault. It is good that in some way that sin entered the world. That's what, oh, happy fault means. I think that was St. Augustine, right? That, because we wouldn't have Christ, we wouldn't have Christ's suffering and death. We wouldn't have his great love. We wouldn't have that incarnation. We wouldn't have all of that had sin not entered the world. And so God's providence knows best. And it's, I think there's a facile or sort of easy way that people can interpret this or maybe mischaracterize it, where it's like, oh, well, this happened because of X, Y, and Z. No, we don't always know why this happens. And part of that even is an invitation to trust him more deeply.
Right.
And to surrender our will more greatly.
Right. Love can't be without free will. That's one thing. And
right.
So it has to happen. And why would a God make a world like that? Well, we would be in heaven and we wouldn't be here if there was nothing, but then we wouldn't have learned to love on our own. If God just made us all perfect and we were already in heaven, we wouldn't have chosen that. And so he gives us a chance to learn how to love. And that's what this whole world is about. So one of the things that breaks my heart as you're talking about this ideology is the people that don't understand that they've been swept into it. Like, my heart goes out, and I know we can be tempted to just be mad about it, but there's a lot of unknowing of what's happening. And I think young people in particular who are trying to figure out who they are, and they're looking out at the world and trying to figure things out. And I think without that strong Christian base, or even sometimes with it, we can, miss what's happening. And so that's one of the things I really appreciate about your work, because you've kind of taken a lot of this and kind of just made sense of it. And so anyway, we're moving into this topic of today, which is, why are so many young adults going no contact toward their parents? As you were describing, the ramifications of this ideology, I thought that's the worst one. That is the worst one. Going into the family and dividing families is the evil one's doing and delight. So that's what you're writing about now. So can you just share a little bit about how that's going and what you've learned, and maybe even a few stories about like some of the things people are experiencing? You already talked about one, and some of the things you're encountering as you're going out and speaking. What are some other things you're seeing, and just illuminate us on what you're experiencing.
Yeah, sure. Well, there's different studies, and they're still emerging, because for so long it was hard to get data on this movement because it's oftentimes shrouded in shame and secrecy. But the most accurate studies I've seen, one out of Cornell, says there's about one out of 4 Americans are now estranged from a close family member. That's about 68 million people, if I'm remembering correctly. Some, though, say now it's 1 out of 3, 1/3. Now, so based on the 1 out of 4 statistic, the secondary statistic is that 1 out of 5 of those estrangements is over politics. So that is million. I mean, that's pretty close. It's 25% versus 20%. So either way you cut it, it's millions, tens of millions of Americans that are now estranged over ideology. And so that is not totally new, but it is something that is not in line with the history of estrangement. So there's always been family estrangement, banishment. From the most ancient times, there were ways in which elders of society would maybe get together and say, this person is too dangerous or too threatening, or threatens sort of our social unity, and they need to be sort of cast out or cast away. And it was always for the sake of kind of preserving kind of common unity or social memory. And hopefully, often in the most appropriate ways, it was done to repair, even with the person who is on the receiving end of it. Now, my scope of my book is not whether or not that was just or effective. That's just setting the stage of what factually had been. It was in the 20th century that family estrangement took a different tenor, and it was, I would say, a very ideological one. And this was really representative, most maybe acutely in Maoist China, where young adults were invited to, or encouraged, incentivized to denounce their parents publicly for not having the proper political views, to tell on them, and then to, in a struggle session, sort of denounce and humiliate them. And there's plenty of. I have some anecdotes from adult kids from those days that experienced that pressure, either kowtowed to it or were somehow able to elude it. But it sounds dramatic to say, but the no contact movement of today, I would say, if it has an ideological antecedents, it's closer to those 20th century denunciations than I would say the history of estrangement. For one thing, it tends to be the young against the old, which is more aligned with the 20th century. It also tends to be for the sake of forgetting what has come before, not for the sake of preserving a common memory, but really for social forgetting. So a lot of the language of the no contact movement will be, we have been conditioned to think that family is important and that these relationships are sort of crucial. But that's just social conditioning. The family is actually just a construct. So they've really adopted what had been very academic, kind of ivory tower type of revolutionary academic language. It's gone a little pop culture. It's gotten more mainstream, as these things tend to do. But that in itself is, again, speaks to sort of this forgetting. We're going to shuffle off the old and bake into something new. And so what is replacing the family of origin would be what they talk about as the chosen family. A chosen family is when you estrange yourself from your family and you find the family of your choice. You can think of this in a benign, even benevolent way. When people go through crisis and their friends become like family, that's a normal experience. Mm-hmm. Or you think of, things like Friends and Sex and the City, which, those shows were, not funny, but maybe not great, not good moral arbiters of what we should aim for. But it really started seeping into our popular mindset, this idea that, it's not about the family sitcom anymore. It's really about the friend group, or, in Sex and the City, it wasn't about, finding your spouse. It was about actually your best friends are your real spouse, Anyway, these things sort of introduce that in a sort of a non-threatening way. But now it's more dramatic, where people are saying, like, I'm going to find my chosen family because family is construct, and the family I choose is an exercise of my autonomy. So this really plays a large part in it too. That one of the things that oftentimes people say in the no contact movement is, I didn't choose to be born. You chose to have me, and so you owe me everything. I owe you nothing. And, if you dig into what that actually means, that statement actually means, it's a rejection of being, the good of being. My life is not a blessing, it's a burden. You did something to me that I didn't consent to. And that really sounds like assault. I was listening to this one therapist talk about the no contact movement, and he said, if there's something to that, that these kids feel that they didn't consent to being born. Why? Because if you as a parent inflicted life upon unsuspecting flesh, you really do owe it a lot. And I was so chilled by his phrasing. It really sounds like assault. And what a reframing that is of parenthood in general. I mean, we've always, for centuries, have understood parenthood to be a noble thing to do, a noble role, a role of generosity, a role of sacrifice. And now it's really, I think the implication is really that it is something selfish. And you hear people talk about that. So there's a real connection between the birth dearth and, people choosing not to become parents. And I think the no contact movement, that if the parenting role is now something that is demonized, well, all the hard work and generosity and suffering that accompanies parenthood, if that's no longer seen as something noble, but something selfish, then why would you ever engage in it? Yep, and if it can end in isolation and estrangement and demonization, well, I don't want that. Why would I move into that category of being? Mm-hmm. Anyway, so there's a real connection there. But I got off on a bit of a tangent. So what it looks like, I mean, there's multivariate causes. It's not just one thing. It is, rise of the therapeutic self and therapy speak. I mean, I think that we're so soaked in therapy speak that it makes us less able to feel that we can triumph over our struggles, because we say, I'm just going to label someone, you're a narcissist, or you're gaslighting me, or, I'm in trauma. Like all this language is framing even to ourselves our lives as being some things that are out of control and deeply threatened by other people. And it's also kind of castigating someone else very easily. Now, that's not to say there aren't real narcissists. There certainly are. And that, I think, itself is also contributing to this too. That the more that we become a narcissistic culture, the less able we are to have healthy relationships. It's just pretty obvious. But the therapy speak, I do think, is making us weaker and less able to triumph over our struggles, and to kind of learn that natural friction that family life is supposed to dispose us to learn, which is my will is not the king of my world. That it's going to rub up against someone else's will, and then there's going to be friction, and then maybe we won't handle it well, but then we can come back in forgiveness. We can receive and extend grace. These are all the sort of the rough and beautiful things that intimacy of family life invites us to do. But if we have trained ourselves, I think, through this therapy speak and the therapeutic self, to think that those things are actually just threats, and that we can be quick to label someone, and that we can understand trauma in a far broader and more accessible way that is more common than we ever used to consider it, well, then we're really catastrophizing all of those normal kind of family conflicts. So I think that's a real factor. There's a lot there. There's also a rising divorce culture, which is, trained people to think that we can be replaced. Now, I'm not condemning anyone who's gone through divorce. I love people who have had to go take that measure. Certainly there are justifications for it. But it's just impossible to say that we can, explode the divorce numbers and not have that create a message to the next generation that intimate family members are, in some ways, far more replaceable than what we might have thought of before. So I do think that that's a factor too. Yeah,
I'm going to go even further and say maybe like even surrogacy or, situations where things are not irreplaceable, right? You can replace the mother or a father with another father, or you can. We're using each other, and the child is forgotten in all of that. So
that's right.
That contributes.
You can curate your family too.
Yeah. So then people are replaceable.
Right.
And that is not the Christian vision. We're very, very irreplaceable and unique throughout time, and God had us in mind from the beginning. I know those ideas are getting cast out now. No, we're not special. We're just here, right?
That's
and
right.
Maybe against our will. So
that's right.
Before we go to break, I want to just the thought that I've had and I'm having now. I grew up in an imperfect family. My dad was an alcoholic for many years. Ended up coming back to the church and went through treatment and got through that in a beautiful way, and died married to my mom and in a holy death. But it wasn't without problems, nor was my childhood. I can never imagine estranging from my parents. It goes against anything, and that I could imagine. It's so,
yeah.
I guess, yeah. How did that happen?
Yeah, well, I think that points to something, a really important factor that I would be neglectful of me to not mention, but that we've re-understood the family. You're coming at it from a family as the pre-political institution, a natural institution that is deeply human and precedes politics, which I think is right. And so that means that it gives you the ability and framework to say, I'm going to stick this out and love this person. Now, I think that we have to understand that family is now post-political in the minds of a lot of people, meaning if it's just a construct, your politics are more directly affecting who you are, your identity, your character, your relationships, and defining those in light of what your politics are. So morality fundamentally has shifted, where it is not how I behave, what I choose, what I do. It is, what do I advocate for? And am I on the right side of advocacy? And then what is immoral then, and what you need to distance yourself from and not be complicit in, is those who are not on the right side in their advocacy. If they're not advocating for the right things, then they actually are a threat to the community. And so it creates this impetus to kind of scrub clean your social circle. And also it has a moral purpose according to their minds. Like there's such a thing as strategic shunning. I have to shun the people who don't have the right beliefs, and hopefully that will correct them, So yeah, I think that maybe gets to the heart of it. Is the family a pre-political institution, or is it a construct?
Wow. But still, I still don't understand how people don't understand, that's my mom, that's my dad. Yeah. But I guess it's just the mind is formed a different way. And so you can jump over there. I just can't.
Yeah. I think ideological possession is hard to wrap our minds around. And not everyone who does this, I'm saying, is totally ideologically possessed. There are degrees of people in this, so far as they do this. But part of that possession is really having to retrain yourself out of those natural roles, and to train yourself to think, I feel guilt because this is my family, but I need to get over that because that is a construct. I've been conditioned to think that. And it's a very religious sort of cult-like training, but they say it very openly, even on places like TikTok. If you're feeling guilt, you need to get over that. That's just your conditioning. You need to triumph over this. This is your struggle. It's religious-like talk in order to reorient yourself out of those sort of natural pieties.
Wow. I think on the other side of the break, I'm going to because I've never heard that ideological possession term before. So I think I'm going to have you go into that a little bit. And then we'll get into some hope. We're going to go into some hope too. So Noelle will be right back with more Matters of Soul Importance after this break.
Get 6 months of local news for just $2. You get unlimited access to the news and information you need to stay connected to your community. Visit inforum.com/subscribe to get 6 months of local news for just $2.
Welcome back to Matters of Soul Importance. My guest this morning from California is Noelle Mering. She is the author of Awake Not Woke. And now she's also writing a book about the no contact phenomenon that we're experiencing in our world today. Basically estrangement, children, young adults estranging, leaving, abandoning, rejecting their parents, which is a shift from what estrangement used to look like, as she explained. There's a lot going on, as you can hear. I wanted to hear more about the ideological possession term that Noelle brought up before the break. So, Noelle, can you kind of illuminate that for us a little bit?
Sure. Ideological possession is sort of just what ideology tends us towards. So because ideology is trying to fulfill the role of something all-encompassing that can answer all questions in the world and the universe, it's claiming sort of a godlike authority. And so when we subscribe to something that is not God and treat it as though it is God, it tends to possess us because there's a lot of ways in which it's answering questions that it cannot answer, but we have to sort of give it that sort of authority anyway. And so it tends to make us addicted to the view that we're trying to proclaim. And this can be not only for woke people, obviously, this can be there's ways in which the right can do this easily. And, any time we put something above God, a worldview above God, and become addicted to it, this can possess us in a cult-like way. Yeah. But it tends to make us prioritize sort of the ideological beliefs, even in defiance of like obvious examples of it being false. We are so attached, like religiously attached to our ideology being true, that we will deny not only obvious ways in which it's wrong, but also be willing to lose our compassion, our empathy. It can lead to sort of cherry picking, confirmation bias. I mean, this is, anytime we become insanely religiously political, this is what happens, regardless of what those political beliefs are. So it's again, just saying it's not singular to one perspective. It is anytime we elevate basically political beliefs over God. This is the way it tends us towards. So, so it just does that help?
Yes. Yeah. Well, I'm thinking about something else, and I wasn't sure if I was going to bring it up, but just yesterday, as we're recording, something broke out in Minneapolis, and I saw a headline, and then I had to go on and do what I do on Wednesdays, which is pray for abortion, and at our abortion facility here nearby. And one of our sidewalk advocates mentioned something that was going on, and she was worried it was going to be another George Floyd incident kind of a thing in Minneapolis. So I've kind of had to, as much as I'm like wanting to not worry about that stuff, just because it just gets to be so overwhelming. But it just like, you can't help it, just like, especially on social media, which is where some of my work goes. So I still have a place that I have to be as a writer, as a communicator, but I could see all the stuff spilling out already, kind of to what you're saying, and the confirmation bias. It's like, okay, all those people who are always on this side said that. And then there's the people on that side that said that. And here we are again. And I don't want to jump in with emotion and go crazy.
Yeah, that's right. I think that's a signal of ideological possession. It's when we are not willing to be slow in our response, that we are so trained to be reactive and we're so addicted to finding in events vehicles for our outrage that everything becomes an instrument of our outrage, right? So a news event, like, how can I use this to further the ideology that I'm trying to promote, rather than wait, see, be slow to respond, be curious, what actually happened here? What are the arguments? That it's just like feed my addiction to my outrage. That is a sign of ideological possession.
And I'm starting to like back way off. I've always kind of waited until some of the, things kind of fall and then I'll write about it. But even more now, I just feel like, why can't we slow down here and why is everyone an expert here and so much passion? So it goes right into what you're saying. And what saddens me is like people don't see it. They just jump right in. It's like they fall into the trap every time. And I'm just wanting to say, let's just wait and see. And of course, I'm talking about the ICE agent who shot and killed a woman in Minneapolis. But again, what were the extenuating circumstances? But it goes along with what you said too, I think, about erasing history, because we're not even willing to look at the context of a thing. Right.
It's black and white thinking. Yeah.
Immediately we know,
right.
And we're sure of it and certain. So anyway, right. I'm saddened that I think this is a ploy of the devil to keep us divided with these things and these deflections. But anyway, again, wanting to move more into a hopeful place. So how can we transition into that hopeful place? Maybe you can give us some examples of things that people have done or things that you suggest for families that are in this, because I just saw something yesterday from someone who's in a situation of estrangement on a private Facebook page, and her heart is absolutely broken. She's actually holding up pretty well. Has a very strong faith, but the way she described it just tore my heart. Because it's like this grief that you can't do much about. It's just this ongoing, and so I don't know. But there's got to be some things we can do, and some ways we can think about this, and some actions we can take as Christians when this happens within our families, or maybe to help another family.
Yeah, no, it is utterly heartbreaking. And I would say, I interviewed a lot of parents about this, and I would say the vast majority of them, I think, are just truly caught up sort of in a moment in time where all of a sudden, this has become this huge thing. And, I think that there are parents out there who, now this is what makes it a fraught topic, is that there truly are parents who probably were bad, not great, maybe narcissistic, whatever. And they'll jump on this opportunity to now take on the victim role. Like, oh my gosh, I'm part of this, And so that I feel like I always have to make that caveat, because there are those parents out there. But that being said, the vast majority of the ones that I talk to, I think it really is this just being caught up in this moment where this is spreading like wildfire. So one of the responses, I think, actually goes straight to what we were just talking about. And one of the things I'd say in the book is, we need to be curious. That we need to, because it feeds into the reaction cycle. So there's just a story in the Wall Street Journal about some parents who are banding together, and they're publicly kind of talking about how their kids cut them off. And, the mom calls them, or one of the things she says is, did you raise some ungrateful little bastards too? Anyway, it's just this, they're taking on the position of grievance themselves, where they're now the victims, and they're going to sort of fight fire with fire and mirror what their kids have done to them. I caution this at not being the correct way to respond to this. So I think there are two errors that parents can fall into it. And then there's a middle ground that I think is the healthy one. So one error would be to sort of do that, to just kind of get angry, become reactive, try to control them. A lot of parents when it's because, a lot of parents have been cut off because they voted for Donald Trump. That was a very common thing I saw in newspaper articles about this, and also interviews. So, sometimes the instinct would be like, well, I'm just going to send them this article and that'll show them why. And we're just going to send them this argument, get in a political argument. Oftentimes they know what we believe, and this is not fully a rational disagreement anyway. And so we're not just going to argue someone into it. And so I think controlling, either through shaming or through, constant, barraging them with information, is one error on one extreme. The other extreme is endless capitulation. So some parents have made it their greatest goal is the reunification and to maintain it, to not lose that relationship. And so they'll do anything it takes to maintain it. So, say a child is transitioning and the parent is, I talked to some progressive parents who were very supportive of transgenderism, but when it came to their child, maybe it felt scarier because they were like, I don't want my child to go through this medicalization and these surgeries. And this is, there's something that just immediate in them. Then when they see it happening to their child, that it's alarming. But then they'll set a line, say, okay, well, we love you, but we're not going to pay for any of this. And then they'll say, okay, we'll pay for some of it because the child's getting mad that they won't pay for it. And then, okay, well, now we'll go this far. Now we'll support the surgery. So that's another extreme, I think, is that there is no higher authority than that relationship salvaging. And so you wind up just endlessly kind of affirming and capitulating and doing whatever the child wants and letting the child who's sort of become an authoritarian to you sort of dominate you. And I think so two extremes. One is control, the other is capitulation. And I think the right response is to sort of adopt the posture of the prodigal father, who is obviously kind of the model of this, where, what did he do? He allowed and respected the freedom of his son. He did not run after him. He did not chase him. He did not try to force him to come home. He understood this is your free choice. And, but he also didn't do what the elder brother did. He didn't sit around calculating his offenses or the injustices at hand, or, counting costs and trying to strive for some sort of charity, loveless justice. Or, he just tended to what was under his control and under his authority, his home and his son and his servants. And he waited. And when his son came back, he immediately ran to him. In other words, he wasn't a triumphalist. Mm-hmm. He wasn't demanding of a big apology. He just said, you coming back is basically kind of that's a turn in your soul. And I'm going to meet it with total gratuitous love. And so I think that gives us a model of, respecting their freedom, but also not calculating the wrongs, the injustices, which is normal. I find that there's two things we can get caught up in if this is happening to us. One is excessive blame, or the other is excessive guilt. So I'm either going to sit around blaming my child, or, blaming maybe the person who maybe polluted my child's mind to turn them against me, or that happens a lot. Or I'm going to be racked with guilt and just constantly recount, how could I have done this differently? What could I have done? When, both of those can swallow you. Both have their place. Blame can be a ward against, taking an undue responsibility for things that are out of your control. Maybe you need to say, okay, they should have done that differently. Guilt can be good because it can help us to own what we ought to own. But both can be really played against us and can consume us. And so I think understanding a healthy relationship between those two is also really important. A lot of people recommend writing an amends letter. I do have a happy story that I'll share of a parent who their child estranged from them. It came to a head. This is a very popular, common reason for estrangement. The parents didn't get the COVID vaccine, and so the child was having a wedding, and they wouldn't allow them to come to the wedding. And then they were so mad that they didn't just get the shot to come to the wedding that they wound up cutting them off. And so one mother she was very, heartbroken over this, and she wrote what's called an amends letter. A therapist named Joshua Coleman talks a lot about this, where you just write a simple letter. You don't give context. You don't say, well, because you did this, I had to do this, or I responded like this. You don't try to justify anything. You just say, what can I honestly own here? Like, is there some way that I can honestly own some aspects of this and not deflect at all? And most times there are, right? Oftentimes I overreacted at some point, or maybe I didn't listen as well as I should, but finding something. And then she wrote this letter, didn't hear back, was heartbroken, and then found out that there was, without getting into details, because I don't want it to be clear who it is, but there was some miscommunication. The daughter finally got the letter, and now they're walking their way back into contact, and it's going well so far. So some parents are living in the ambiguity, as you said. Part of the reason why it's so painful is because it feels like a death. It really does feel like a death. But they'll say, a death has a finality and it has a social recognition. That people understand what you've gone through. There's a shame to it. A lot of mothers struggle with that. How could a child not love a mother? This is my whole role.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's, oftentimes an unwarranted shame. So there's a lot of complexity there, and living with that ambiguity when you don't have closure is really hard. And it's one of the things I try to address more deeply in the book, but that's a snapshot of it.
Kind of going back, because I'm thinking of someone maybe who took maybe more on the shame. Just what would you recommend to someone like that, and someone with a Christian worldview? Like, what are some healing remedies while we wait for things to take their course?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the most important things, and some advice I gleaned. So I try to summarize all the advice from all the interviews, and one of the common thing I found is that. Parents, some of them are very private about it. Others have said, I just have to let in a crew of people. Some are very more public about it, but I find that having objective, trusted eyes that you can be bouncing all this off of is incredibly important, because it is so confusing. It's so easy to err on one side or the other in the way you remember it and interpret it, and blame or guilt, that spiral that I was talking about earlier. And to have sort of an objective, trusted person who knows you, loves you, and understands your story intimately is incredibly important. That can be a priest, it could be a pastor, it could be your dear friends, it could be some sort of mentor, it could be a counselor, a therapist. But I would say, first of all, you cannot navigate this on your own, or even just with your spouse, because spouses are both in the mix of it, in the muck of it. And so they both, and you and your husband, or you and your wife might need separate sort of objective eyes, so that you're not confusing one another either, but I think clarity is such a blessing in times of confusion and sorrow, because the devil wants to confuse you, and he wants to keep you in a place of confusion. That makes you anxious. It makes you disordered, and so striving to think simply, I think, is really key to growing in peace. How can I think about this in the most simple way that I can, that is not kind of going off to one extreme or the other? I think that's a really important part of this, taking ownership where I can. And that's why I think one of the amends letter is such a good idea, is because it might be good just to say, I have said, and simply and clearly on paper, this is what I own, and I'm so sorry, and I gave it to you. There's just to have, I took that concrete measure, I think can be really important towards peace too.
Right. How about, like, spiritually speaking, like, what can people do in their faith life to kind of come to that place of balance, would you say? Do you have anything like that?
Yeah, well, I think that, the parental identity is so deep. And, as I said before with mothers, this really is a deeply held identity. Moms tend to struggle with this more than dads. And I would say, this is an opportunity to try to see it and reframe it. Easier said than done. But it's an opportunity to see that even our motherhood is not our deepest identity. Our deepest identity is daughters, sons of God. And so how do I shift my self-understanding, radically shift my self-understanding, that I can this thing that is so good, so important, so intimate to me, it's my motherhood or my fatherhood. How can I even displace that and center God and my relationship with him, even above that? And one mom that I talked to, I loved this. I thought this was powerful. She's gotten to the point now where she's so intimate with our Lord that she was praying and she was saying, so I'll say his name is John, the son. That's not his name, obviously, but she's like, John's going through this, and this. We haven't talked in this long. And she's like, I'm not sure exactly what to do with it, but why don't she was saying, these are her words to God. If there's anything you need me to do on that end, like or more reaching out or any more efforts I need to take, just let me know. Otherwise, I'm just like, I understand that you've got this. In other words, and it was such a simple prayer, but she was like, this is how I pray now. I just say, anything you need me to do there, or you got it still. It's almost like this is not on my agenda list anymore. I so totally trust you to be, because I don't have power here. And so I totally have surrendered control over his life, what's going on with him, our relationship to you. that my prayer is now just like, let me know when I need to get back in there if there's anything else for me to do, because I so trust that it's on your docket.
That's beautiful, and that is the only thing we really can do. Along with, as you were kind of saying, kind of just like building up that relationship of our own daughter or son of God. Because that is primordial. And I remember one of my spiritual directors mentioning that to me one time. He said, what is your most important role? And I'm like, at the time, I'm like, well, my mothering, of course, I was in the midst of that. And he said, no, it's actually like what became before that is you're a daughter of God. And that was really helpful for me because it kind of pulled me away, just like what you're saying right now. And I think that's so important to return to that, because in all of our brokenness, ultimately we can only do what we can do, and control it. We can, the serenity prayer would be a good one to pull into this, Oh, this has been so helpful and informative. And I hope will bring hope to those who are experiencing this, because it is so painful. I've journeyed with several mothers that have gone through this, one right now, two that will send me things that her brother has been sending to her and her parents. And it's just, it's like, I can't believe a child would talk like this, but it all makes sense in light of how you've described it, Noelle. And so where can people find out more about you? And what do you want to tell people? You're doing so many great things.
Oh, thank you. Well, what I want to tell people, I guess one final thing that occurred to me is just that every time we worry, and I think we're so prone to worry, especially because this is such a painful thing, but we tend to worry about anything we're struggling with in our life, but worry should always be turned into prayer. And so if we can just have a mantra of, when I'm worrying, that is an instinct, an impulse actually to prayer. And worry is sort of the misappropriation of that instinct.
Yeah.
So how can we get into a habit of turning our worry into a prayer? That's just one last thing I thought to say. How can they find me? So I have a Substack. It's called Family Revival, and it's also attached to my name, Noelle Mering. And that's really where I'm sort of trying to do some proactive things. This is where I'm putting my work with the no contact movement and all else. It's also where my husband and I are doing some new initiatives to help build up families through friendship, mentorship, various things. And so I think that's the best place to find me. I'm also at the Ethics and Public Policy Center as a fellow, eppc.org, and my work is all there, and as well as my colleagues who are doing wonderful things for families and policy and culture as well.
Well, thank you so much. I always come back to the initial question, which I think you've answered in full, but why are so many young adults going no contact? What is the snippy answer that you can offer?
Yeah.
If you can boil it down.
The snippy answer is it's just a new way to divide us from each other and to make us disintegrated, both as individuals, but also as families and as civics in our civic life. So division is of the devil. And I think this is just a way to attack us. And it's a form of self-rejection and familial rejection and ultimately social rejection. So,
and I think to just remember that God is really in control. It might not seem like it, but He is, and He can reach our children and He can reach into these divisions in ways that we can't. So just to stay grounded in Him and in our primary identity and love those in our midst that are willing to receive it. So thank you so much for joining us. And I just really appreciate it, Noelle, and just God bless you and your work.
Thanks, Roxanne. Likewise. I love what you're doing and great to chat with you.
Why are so many young adults going no contact toward their parents? If you didn't understand why before this episode, I hope you'll have a better grasp of it now. I find Noelle's insight on this topic and so many of the cultural issues we're facing right now so on point, but also so prophetic, really, since she seems to be at the edge of these moments and able to articulate them in such a concise way. I really appreciated her concrete suggestions on what not to do if you're a parent in this situation, dealing with the painful reality of a child who has gone no contact, to neither try to control nor capitulate. We need to reclaim our dignity as parents, as Noelle has said in other conversations, and I think that's an important starting point, placing ourselves rightly before God. Once we're situated there, We can calmly move through whatever storms rage with the only backing that matters, God Himself. We know from the Bible that division within families is not new. Look at the Old Testament. We find it everywhere. But it's not God's desire or design. As we read in Philippians 4:8, one of my favorites, "Finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things." I loved, too, Noelle's drawing on the prodigal father to guide us. What a beautiful and fitting story to remind us of how our Father regards and welcomes us back in times of strain. As I've said to other parents who have felt alienated from their children, leave the light on, because when your children return, they'll be able to see that light and know that it's okay to come back inside. Ultimately, too, in the waiting moments, the best course is surrendering to God, who's the only one who has the power to do anything about any of our human discord. Taking our energy from these sorts of conflicts, letting God take them over, allows us to release ourselves from the negative energy and bring life to other areas needing it. There's so much we can do, even in these most challenging moments of family life. As Noelle suggested, may we practice the posture of letting our worry be an impulse toward prayer. Well, our next guest is a praying mama of younger children who will be helping us answer this question. What can C.S. Lewis, a man who has been dead for over 60 years, teach us today? She's written a book that takes a modern twist on this impactful Christian author's classic, The Screwtape Letters, among other interesting pursuits. So I hope you'll come back in a few weeks to find out more. Until then, don't lose sight of the light.